William the Conqueror had, by 1068, already faced down severe challenges to his rule, notably the attempted seizure of Dover by a coalition of Kentishmen and his companion at Hastings, Eustace of Boulogne, as well as resistance in the southwest, centred in the city of Exeter, which he subdued in the spring. By May of 1068, the king felt sufficiently assured of his grip on power to call on his Duchess, Matilda, to make the trip from his native Normandy to be crowned as queen. The ceremony itself was attended by many leading Englishmen, yet if William felt the worst was behind him, then he was dead wrong. Trouble now bubbled to the boil in the north, a region as yet untouched by the Norman war machine. In theory, the north was already under William's thumb, in the person of Morcar, the Earl of Northumbria, since 1065. Morcar, along with his elder brother Edwin, the Earl of Mercia, had submitted shortly after Hastings, but in actuality Morcar himself did not have full control of his own province. He himself was an outsider, actually being a Mercian and having been elected as Earl by the Northumbrian nobles themselves following their successful rebellion against Tostig Godwinson in late 1065. The death of Gospatrick, the head of the House of Bamber, had triggered the revolt to begin with and caused Morcar to cede de facto control of the area beyond the Tyne to the murdered Gospatrick's nephew, Oswulf. Enter into this delicate mix William. At the beginning of 1067, the king had undermined this arrangement by appointing a Yorkshire thane, Copsey, as Earl of that region. This left a bad taste in the mouths of Morcar and Oswulf, as Copsey was a hated rival and former lieutenant of Tostig, whom the Northerners had ejected from power in the first place. Unfortunately for him, Copsey's tenure would be short-lived, as he was ambushed and beheaded by Oswulf himself. Oswulf too would not long enjoy his success, as he too was slain by a robber in the autumn of the same year. Morcar on the surface of it seemed to be rid of two local rivals for power, but this was not so. In fact, Gospatrick, yet another scion of the House of Bamber, now moved to seize the northern part of Morcar's nominal territory, petitioning William himself at some point, after his return in 1068. Worse for Morcar, it's likely he was not really in de facto control of his earldom south of the Tyne either. Following his and his brother's failure at Fulford Gate in 1066, the then King Harold Godwinson had given actual control to a certain Malswain, the Sheriff of Lincolnshire, a state of affairs likely unaltered by this time. Another possible factor explaining events to be told was the growing chorus of dissent in the surviving English nobility who had had their lands confiscated, not for fighting William at Hastings, but for not being able to pay the too heavy gelds demanded since. Among the most prominent of the surviving leading men post-Hastings, it's clear both brothers were obvious centres of resistance to the Norman oppressors. Whatever promises William had made to the brothers too had been undercut by his cold, hard actions. They had been ordered to accompany the king back to Normandy following their initial submissions, and despite William's tall pledge to grant Edwin authority over his younger brother and a third of all England, as well as the honour of the king's own daughter in marriage, this reality had failed to materialise. Edwin's authority too had been decidedly undermined by William's establishment of new earldoms centred around Hereford and Shrewsbury. Hereford, under William Fitzosborne, included Worcester, that had previously been under Edwin's sphere. Shropshire had been absorbed into Roger of Montgomery's control and was incontrovertibly formerly a Mercian area. To be fair to William, however, it's proper to state that he likely created the earldoms as a check on the Welsh, the region being a recent area of rebellion under Adric the Wild. These considerations, though, also likely held little comfort to the disillusioned Earl of Mercia. As for the prospective marriage, Orderic Batalis relates that, quote, listening to the dishonest counsels of his envious and greedy Norman followers, William withheld the maiden from the noble youth, who greatly desired her and had long waited for her. England thus proved a powder keg waiting to explode, and indeed the rising of the Earls Edwin and Morcar set off a similar slew of rebellions. Orderic writing that, quote, a general outcry arose against the injustice and tyranny inflicted on the English. All were ready to conspire together to recover their former liberty and bind themselves by weighty oaths against the Normans. Bledin, a Welsh king, threw his lot in with the brothers, already being a veteran supporter of Adric the Wild's insurgency. Interestingly too, despite their superficial rivalry for power in the north, both Malswain, de facto Lord of Yorkshire, and Gospatrick, the Earl north of the Tyne, also supported the revolt, these men clearly viewing the Norman threat as the greater to their own power. One major voice in support of King William was the man who had crowned both him in 1066 and then his wife Queen Matilda recently. The aged Archbishop of York, Eldred, would prove a stalwart if ineffective voice against rebellion, though the Bishop of Durham did not share his support of the foreign Norman monarch. What set the seal on the whole rising and gave it the definitive air of legitimacy was the endorsement of Edgar Atheling, great-nephew of King Edward the Confessor himself. Edgar had briefly been elected king in the immediate weeks following Hastings, but had submitted by the end of 1066. William, according to William of Poitiers, highly valued Edgar's friendship as a kinsman to the revered Confessor and had granted lands to him. William, however, whatever his true feelings towards the Atheling's defection, wasted no time stamping out this resistance. Orderic tells us that the king marched north, initiating a castle-building spree. The king threw up a castle at Warwick, and then received the swift submission of the nominal leaders of the revolt, Edwin and Morcar. Nottingham also fell, and another castle scarred the landscape. The advance, too, was no passive military parade. William's army cutting a path of destruction north, the Anglo-Saxon chronicles stating, quote, "William allowed his men to harry wherever they came." Nottingham's fall prompted the terrified citizens of York to send both hostages and the very keys of their city to the Conqueror before the king himself arrived there to build yet another castle. Pointedly though, not all the leaders of the revolt folded so quickly. Malswain, Gospatrick, and Edgar himself fled north into the arms of Malcolm, King of Scots, who also backed the action. Malcolm had likely intended to back the revolt in force, but apparently lost control of his men in Bernicia, their harrying of the area, a revenge attack for Gospatrick's own raid into Cumberland a few months earlier. Events appeared to have overtaken all concerned. William's taking of York and the general rapid response, as well as its ferocity, clearly unnerved all concerned. Gospatrick not only made a quick peace with Malcolm, but was allowed asylum in his kingdom along with Edgar. William, meanwhile, had left York under the control of Richard Fitz-Richard and a garrison of 500 knights, with William Mallet made Sheriff of Yorkshire. William returned south, building as he did so castles at Lincoln, Huntingdon and Cambridge. This likely seriously blunted the morale of any would-be resistance in any such area. Castles were not just very physical reminders of Norman power, but part of its very manifestation. They provided a safe area from which the mobile and devastating Norman knights could dominate a locality, and also more destructively usually meant houses and buildings being destroyed to make room for them in the settlements in which they were erected. Despite his harbouring of major rebels, William did score a diplomatic victory over his northern counterpart Malcolm before departing York. With the English king so close at hand, Malcolm, through the Bishop of Durham, chose to submit to the Conqueror, though by proxy, so it was hardly a humiliating spectacle. That William accepted such an anemic submission is perhaps surprising, though while he was north confronting the rebels there, the sons of the vanquished King Harold Godwinson had struck in the south. The Godwinson faction had been thwarted earlier on in 1068, when William had moved with similar speed to isolate and besiege Exeter before its defiance under the leadership of Guyfa, the late King Harold's mother, could truly spread to the wider region. Now Godwin, Edmund and Magnus invaded Somerset, harrying the land around the mouth of the Avon. They attempted to seize Bristol, but when repelled, moved back to their ships, raiding south along the Somerset coast. Here the brothers were finally met by the local levies under the captaincy of Ednulf the Staller, both sides suffering heavy losses, but the Godwinson army coming out on top. This victory opened up the way to more raiding into Cornwall and Devon, but ultimately achieved very little. The sons of Harold gathered a lot of loot, but failed to root themselves back on English soil, as perhaps their grandmother Gotha had planned. Instead, they simply returned to their base in Ireland. 1068 had proved a year of success for King William, but hardly a glowing endorsement of his new rule. Yes, the English themselves, both great and lesser, had resisted in the southwest, Midlands, and the north. Malswain, Gospatrick and Edgar remained at large. Groups of local resistance took to the marshes and woods of the realm to attack isolated Norman contingents, and this was just the English menace. Many Norman subjects, too, were proving flaky in their support, the escalating violence persuading many that the enterprise was simply not worth it. Orderic Vitalis, in a comedic but telling fashion, describes the mood among the Norman elite. Quote, "Certain Norman women, consumed by a fierce lust, sent message after message to their husbands, urging them to return at once, and adding that, unless they did so with all speed, they would take other husbands, for they dared not join their men themselves, being unaccustomed to the sea crossing, and afraid of seeking them out in England, where they were engaging in armed forays every day, and blood flowed freely on both sides." The fighting was clearly fierce, to the extent that many knights and lords felt the presence of their wives and womenfolk too risky. Outright desertion in this period was not uncommon, the keepers of both Winchester and Hastings castles abandoning their charges and returning across the Channel. William thus had his own problems besides the English menace, desperately trying to retain as many of his skilled knights as possible to hold what he had won. Unfortunately, this too only fanned the flames of English resistance, as given this faint-heartedness on the part of some of his own faction, the king necessarily had to disinherit more Englishmen and reward those he wished to retain, perpetuating the cycle. Yet despite this disturbing trend, 1068 had overall been a hard-fought year of success for the conqueror. He had put down all challenges to his authority. On paper, the most serious threat in the north proved to have been a paper tiger without teeth, quickly collapsing, and a chain of new castles had also been established, tightening his grip further over his new kingdom. William himself clearly felt secure enough by the close of the year to disband his mercenary force after rewarding them handsomely, and even return to Normandy. Yet if William had felt he had tamed the north, his next move towards consolidating his hold there would prove a deadly miscalculation.